Hey, Dustin Vanoy here. I've been asked a little bit about, can you create a video that shows us Azure DevOps pipelines deploying things to Azure Databricks with my Databricks Asset Bundles? So that's exactly what I'm going to do in this video. The idea is that in the past, I've shown GitHub Actions as a way to set up your automated deployments. Remember that our automated deployments are going to take us to our staging environment and our production environment. Oftentimes we recommend that you do this in each one is its own Databricks workspace, so that's not necessarily a requirement. So what we'll look at is a blog post that was created recently by someone at Databricks that shows us exactly how to do this. So with that, why don't we dive right in? Okay, so we're going to be looking through this blog post from a Databricks colleague. A very good blog post. Go check it out. Check out the GitHub URLs. Let me warn you right now that I am going through a lot of this sort of for the first time as part of this video. So I will include some of the errors and mistakes I made along the way. Some of it I might skip over just for time. So definitely refer to this as your source of reference of what to do. And I'm doing this with a different repository, a different set of code. So I have a few additional things in my code you might not face when you're doing this for your own repository. With that, let's get started. So we start here in Azure DevOps, and we're going to go to my example repository, which is the start of a flights end-to-end demo. I'll probably add a lot more to this, but in this video, we're going to switch over to some code that I've already added, a little bit of a more simple flights project than this might become. But most importantly, we're focusing on the Azure Pipelines YAML and what that looks like as we follow the blog post and get a proper Azure DevOps pipeline set up to work with Databricks Asset Bundles and our Databricks environment. So before we change this pipeline, we're going to need to set up a service connection, which is where we get our permissions. So if you already know about a service principal and service connection in your environment that has access to your Databricks environment, you can jump ahead in this video to where we start to actually make the changes to the YAML and use those properties. As we look through the blog, there's some steps about how to set this up. I'm going to walk through it in a similar way to what the blog shows and do my best to cover these steps for those that need to do this on their end. Now you'll need to grab subscription ID and name and service principal ID and a service principal key, which is a secret that you can configure. I'll go ahead and jump to the spots that I get that from my environment, just so it's easy for you to see. For the service principal, you're going to go to your intra ID, find your app registrations, and then you can create a new one if you don't have a service principal already on the Azure AD side. So create that service principal, and now we have the option to grab some of that information. Let's go ahead and take our application ID and our tenant ID and get those configured. So here I've populated that information. I've populated a secret, and I went and got my subscription info already as well. When I try to run this, I get an error, and that's telling me that I got the wrong subscription ID. So I'm gonna go switch that real quick. The way you do that, you can search for subscriptions, find the subscription page, then get the values for your subscription from there, both the name and the ID. Now to demonstrate getting that secret, you basically jump to this secrets screen and you can add a new one. Make sure you copy that value the first time you create one. So coming back, I've switched my subscription. When I run this, I've now got a new error message. That message is that I haven't assigned permissions for my service principal at the subscription level. So I'm going to add a role assignment, and the permissions of reader should be sufficient for this. At this point, we should just go and verify, and if all those values are correct and you've assigned those permissions, you're good to go. And you can save that connection. And we'll use that in just a bit here. Okay, so now that I've created the service principal and the connection setup, the service connection setup, I can move on to creating my environment variable groups. So what we'll do is we'll go find this library section within Azure DevOps and create a release variable section with our Databricks host and an env variable. Going into library, we can now set up our variable groups. We'll call it the same name as what's in the blog. We'll go ahead and add our Databricks host, and we can actually grab that value from our bundle if we've already got that configured. Or we can go and just get the Databricks host from the URL to our actual Databricks environment. Then the other setting was env, and we'll set this to dev. Go ahead and save that. Now we'll jump over to actually modify the YAML to use these variables. So what you're looking at here is your default minimal pipeline. I'm going to go ahead and just replace this with the example from the blog post. So at the top of this blog post, we've got the ability to just link out the repository. Okay, so from here, I can look for the Azure pipelines.yaml. I can go ahead and just make a copy by hitting the copy raw file button. And then I'll jump over and from Azure DevOps repo, rather than deal with this locally and push it back up, which is how I normally am working when I'm doing DevOps, I'm just going to, for this example, edit it right here in the UI. So as I replace what was there with what was in the repo, I've now got a script that I can work with. So when it's doing the on release stage, we want to use our release variables. We're actually set well because we use the exact same name in this case. Let's go ahead and take a look at the next change, which is we are going to swap out this Azure subscription name with the name of our DevOps connection, which is this right here. Okay, so yours was probably a little different, but this is what I've used. From there, I can take a look, I guess just highlight real quick that this line here, line 39, is going to use a resource ID that is default for Azure Databricks. So you can keep this the same. This line here is to go ahead and display the token. If you're stuck debugging, that's something you could do. I'd try not to print out the token in reality, so I'm going to comment that out and just try to get the token right and not have to look at it. Something that if you're using the Databricks Bundles examples repo, you can leave this all as is. I'm actually doing this in my own repository that's a little bit different. So I'm going to clean up these steps. All these steps here are about installing Python in the correct way, so then setting up Python in the correct way so that we can run our test. So I believe I need the wheel setup tools. I think will come with the other stuff I install. The next step I'm going to do is really just take the same thing I use in my other version of this repository that's in GitHub and use that here. So I'm just going to pip install from my requirements.txt. So I've added my install from requirements.txt. The only other thing that we might come back and change is I might upgrade this Python version to 3.10, which is what I've used in the past. Let's go ahead and just roll with this. I expect to get some sort of error that will debug in a bit. Next, we've got a message that I believe is saying installing the Databricks CLI. And what we're going to do is leave this as is so it can go and do the install of the latest Databricks CLI. Next step's really going to configure our token. Let's leave this as is. I think we're going to be okay with these settings. Now we did set up both a host and a token, so all of this is in line. And what's going to happen is it's going to run this Databricks bundle validate command. So one of the next things we'll do is go and make sure our bundle is all set up, and I'll show you that briefly, but I'll refer you back to prior videos I did with more info about what goes on with the Databricks bundle so you can configure your own in the future. Looking forward, we're going to end up doing the bundle deploy next, which makes a lot of sense. The -T says target, so we've got a dev target, a staging, and a production target, at least in my setup. And so I can go ahead and pick which one to do based on this end variable that we set in our variable group. So I basically defined our development variable group. We'd have a different variable group for other targets. The final step is that we'd run some sort of, the final bundle step at least, is we'd run some sort of job. What I would end up running is something like a notebook validation job. So I'll make that change here. If you had a DLT pipeline you wanted to run, you just have another run command in your workflow. We'll leave this commented out. We can always go back and add more runs later with this. And then it looks like this is using Nutter. I don't actually need that for the way I'm doing my testing, so I'm going to go ahead and clear that out. Again, if you're using Databricks Bundles examples like in the blog, just stick with that and keep that in there. Then finally, this idea of publishing the test results. I will leave this in for now. I forget if this is going to work exactly with my setup. Okay, as we get down to the bottom here, I can see that we've got a to production stage as well. I think I can get going without this, so I'm going to comment this out for now, get my on release working, and then come back and set up the production version of this. Once I commit, it's going to try to run that pipeline. I think I still need to set some permissions, maybe assign my variable groups correctly, but let's go ahead and see what those errors are, just in case you hit that same thing on your side. We're all on the same page. Okay, so we can see it kicked off successfully without an error, but it also skipped the on release job. So we need to actually set this up in a way where the on release gets triggered. So by looking at the code, I could tell that I need to have a releases branch for that on releases step to run. So I'm gonna go ahead and create that. I'll populate it from main to begin with. If you have a different branch you wanna use for this initial merge of code and running of the pipeline, you can tweak the YAML to use a different name other than releases when it's referencing the branch. And if you're wondering where you would make that change, right here on line 17, source branch is a built-in variable on the refs heads releases. You could change the releases to be a different branch name. I'll quickly run through the PR process here, and that should trigger the pipeline for us so we can continue to debug what else is needed for this to run properly. So now we've made our changes. We can see our pipeline's actually running. In order to use the variables it needs, we have to grant permission here. This is only needed the first time you run this pipeline. Now that we got past that, I have an error message that you might see if you're, especially if you're on like a free tier of Azure DevOps like I am. No hosted parallelism configured. We can follow the link and go register ourselves to have one level of parallelism rather than 0, which is the default. So here we go on the form. I'll go ahead and breeze through filling it out. I don't have a lot of insider knowledge on this except just what it prompts for. And so probably you're dealing with a private repository like I am, and you can just choose the private box and tell it your organization. Once that's submitted, it can take some time to get a response from Microsoft saying that you've been approved and allocated that parallelism. Okay, I've skipped forward to about a day later, maybe a day and a half. I got an email in the middle of the night saying that I've been approved for parallel runs. Keep in mind that the parallelization, one run is equal to one parallel run. So you start off with 0 until that form that we just filled out gets approved. So go ahead and do that. If you're on a free tier like me and you need to get that turned on, just take your give yourself some time for that email to come back to you. All right, jumping forward, let's go ahead. I tried it a bunch of times. Let's go ahead and run this pipeline. I've got it configured for the releases branch to be what triggers the one that I did not comment out. So we're going to see if our on releases piece of our pipeline will actually run now. I'm anticipating that it will run, but we'll get an error related to permissions when we try to submit our bundle runs. Let's see what happens. Clicking in after just a little bit of time running, I can see that it's making some progress and trying to actually do some installs this time. So my trigger worked, my installs seems to have worked okay. And then we get to the bundle deploy or validation, and I get an error. Let's see if it will tell me what the error is. Again, I expect it to be a permissions error right now. Okay, here I can see the error of user not authorized, which is exactly what I anticipated. The blog post does tell us how to handle that. I'm going to do it a very similar way, except instead of doing it at the account level, I'm going to jump to my workspace level and add my service principal there. So to catch up to how I got here, I went to my user at the top. I am an admin. I went to settings. That gets me here. From settings, I go to identity and access, manage service principals. I do have a service principal. It's not the one I've been using. So to add this service principal, I can go down to select and see if it exists. I do not think this will yet. No, it does not exist yet. So I need to go add new in my case. I want to link it to Microsoft Intra ID. Now I need to get a bit of information from my service principal page. So first we need the application ID. which I think is this client ID here. Microsoft continues to use two different names for that little thing, but at least they tell us it's both application ID and client ID. Come here, paste that in. Now let's go grab the service principal name. I believe you can vary this if you want to. I don't see the benefit in using a different name here, so I'm going to use the exact same name, and it doesn't really matter if I want it to be different at this point. Okay, so I've got this service principal. Because I'm an admin and I added it, I should have permissions to use it. I think I need this to have cluster creation. I actually don't need Databricks SQL access, but that's just fine with me. I can go and set more detailed permissions in a variety of ways. Now, what you'll want to do is make sure that you or anyone that needs to leverage the service principal has some permissions either to use the service principal or manage it. Okay. Coming back to what we really want to do is make sure the service principal also has the permissions it needs on the Databricks side. So in the blog post, it had us add a service principal. It looks very similar, even though it recommended doing it from the account section. I'm not sure if I need to add any additional permissions. So let's just test it out and see. So I will go to run new. Choose that releases branch to fire off the same exact thing as before. And let's find out what happens. Okay, we can see we did get an error on the run simple workflow. There's probably a very good reason for that in my case. And if you're using the exact bundle example, perhaps you don't get that same error. Okay, so for me, it is a permissions error. If you look really closely down at the bottom, you see permission denied. Does not have access to use schema main flights test. Okay, so this is where we do have to set some permissions. Okay, after assigning permissions at the catalog level, I was not able to do the table drop. So let me go ahead and, as the current user that owns that table, go ahead and drop this table. Please note, this is just a test table, so it's completely fine. And then once that service principal is the run as user that creates the table, we shouldn't have a problem there. I still might have to go set some permissions on other catalogs, but that's going to vary depending on what exists in your environment and what you're actually going to run with this service principal. So keep that in mind. I will point to other people to advise you on whether separating who deploys this and who your run as user is a better idea than just using the same service principal to do the deploy and to do the runs. I think for production, I'm more likely to do that extra work. In development, I might just stick with the same service principal like I'm doing in this example. Okay, so with that change, I'm going to run the pipeline again, and then we'll check back at the end and see if it made it through or if there's more permissions I need to set. We can take a quick look at the validation job just so we know what's going on here. So basically this validation job is going to create the schema if it doesn't exist. So I probably could have just dropped that schema and been okay. It's going to drop the table if it exists. That was my main problem with permissions the first time around, but now we're good because my service principal can be owner of that table going forward. After that, it runs another job. This job is similar to what, or actually is the same as what my production job would be for this flight data pipeline. And so it's going to pass in a special schema name or database name called flights test instead of my typical database name. We won't get into what all the code's doing, but it's using a few transformations and things. All of this is just Python code that I've written for this data pipeline, and I'm importing it relative path, which means when I deploy everything as a bundle to this location, it can import everything it needs just by using a relative path. I didn't actually package up a wheel in this case. But if you see my other videos or see some of the documentation for dabs, you can easily see how we could package that library as a wheel and install it on my cluster instead. Now, finally, the job is going to actually do the validation. The validation is a set of assertions. In my case, they're not super complex, but we use the assert data frame equal from the native PySpark testing utils. And somewhere down here, we're going to see that we built a starting and ending data set and asserted that the expected counts match what we ended up calculating with our real code. We then can also look at examples where we do a little bit more of a hard-coded count if we know what to expect going in. So that's all my validation job does. Again, this is using a specific schema. For production, I might have to look at whether or not everything else is being run as the same service principal I deployed with, or if I want to switch that in my bundle to overwrite run as with a different service principal. And then coming all the way back, I can see we have a successful release job run. So we got our service principal set up, we got the permission set, and everything worked that time. So great, we got our on release job working, which will happen anytime we're using the releases branch, which is meant to be a step before the main branch in the production deployment. So let me go ahead and go back to the production one, and let's set that one up real quick. I'll go through this fairly quickly because it's a similar idea to what we did already. Okay, so if I continue with just editing right here in the browser, I can go ahead and take a look at my to production stage that's down here. To start with, let's uncomment this section and see that we are looking for the branch main. We can go ahead and uncomment the rest of this section and make the changes to the important parts. So in this case, when we're going to production, it has us running the validate command and running the deploy command. We would have env set to production in that case. So I'm going to go ahead and create the prod variables group similar to release variables. And then I think we'll be in good shape to run this job and have it do the deployment. What I want to call out though is that it does not do a workflow run. You could still have that as like a smoke test in production to run the workflow again. But the idea is that we've already tested everything. We don't really need to do a bunch of unit testing and integration testing in production. I typically have one type of test I use just to like make sure everything's good in the system, kind of a health check before we assume that production deploy has gone well. But in this case, we don't have it in this job. You need to add that separately. So I've committed that to my releases branch. I'm going to go create my prod variables group, and then I will merge this into main, and we'll see it try to run the deploy. So going to pipelines library, I can go and create a new variable group with the correct variables. Okay, so here we create our new variable group, PRD variables. Then we need to set our Databricks host. In many cases, this will be different for production than it is for dev and staging. That's not always true. Sometimes we use the same workspace for each of them. And then within the env variable, you want to set whatever you used as your target name in your bundle, which is your databricks.yaml file. In our case, it is prod, unless you've changed this example. So now if I go back to pipelines and double check my latest runs, I don't have any runs for the main branch. That's really what I'm trying to trigger. So let me go ahead and do a pull request to main. I think it's about the right time to make that happen. I can see a bunch of changes to Azure pipelines, and that's it. I'll go ahead and complete this. Now, the first time we run this, we do need to grant permissions to that variable group. Okay, so a couple things I want to fix based on what I saw. One, I need to get rid of my run as user, but first let's go ahead and change this job name to be to production job instead of on release job. That way it shows up a little differently. Okay. I'll go and commit those changes there. I'm committing to releases. We'll go ahead and do a quick merge to main. And before I do that, I need to commit another set of changes. So the fix is that I've got this run as user trying to be the current username, which doesn't seem to work with my service principal. I would say if you need to set it to run as a different service principal, which is pretty likely you would for production, go ahead and take a look at the docs about that one. For simplicity, since that's not the point of this video, I'm just going to delete this and see if it works properly the way the original example works. Okay, so we went ahead and made that merge. Now let's check on our pipelines. We're going to see two running, the on releases and the production, because of how quickly I made that change. This one's probably going to have to wait for on releases to finish. So I'll check back in a bit to see what the status is. Okay, so we can see that both the releases completed and then my main completed successfully. I did kick off another one for releases because of that secondary change, but that's all right. If I go look at to production, it did all the steps. Remember, it did not run a job because of the way this one's set up, and so it ran pretty quickly to do the deploy. And we need to run into the actual Spark UI to find the jobs that were deployed and test them out. So here's our Flights Notebook job prod that we could go and try to run. It's set up to use the same service principal that I'd configured for production, which is the same one in this case. You might want to change that by changing your service connection. So now I can see my prod job completed when run manually. I did go through and made sure this run as user had the right permissions on the schema to overwrite the table and do whatever it needed. So there we go. We've been able to deploy on release, deploy on prod. We've seen quite a bit about where Azure DevOps Pipelines fits in. And then just kind of the quick review is just that if you follow the blog post, you'll have a different Databricks YAML and different code than I have here. But for this case, the important piece is just that you set up your targets, you make sure you get your host set correctly, and then follow the steps in the blog and the steps in this video in order to get the DevOps piece working. And there we go. We took Azure DevOps pipeline code, we set it all up within Azure DevOps itself. We've run it, we've tested it, and now you know how to do this in your environment. Take a look at the description for more info on how to do some of the steps involved here. And follow this channel by subscribing, and you will get more content about Databricks, data engineering, things that I get to cover when I can find the time. Thank you. See you next time.